Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Today we're looking at Leviticus 14 and 15 where we continue the theme of cleansing. Now I'm down at the beach, as you can see, and the beach is often seen as a place of cleansing. If you can go to Israel, the Dead Sea, it's so salty. People go there for therapeutic reasons, to go lie in the water to get the toxins out of their system. I know many people in this country who come down to the water's edge and they get bottlefuls of seawater and they drink it for weeks on end to cleanse their systems. Now, the book of Leviticus, chapter 13, 14, 15 is dealing with the issue of cleansing and washing. And we saw yesterday that diseases such as leprosy and smallpox and other skin diseases were dealt with thoroughly by the priests. And so they picked that theme up again in chapter 14. And if you think you've been healed, the priest takes you outside the walls so that no one else gets contaminated by you, and he inspects you. And if you are found to be clean, he takes two birds. He kills one over a bucket of water so the blood goes into the water, and he uses that water to sprinkle you like 7 times. And then he takes the other bird, the surviving bird, and he sets that free into the desert to indicate that your sickness has been released and you're free from it. Then sacrifices have to be made, blood on your earlobes and your fingers and your toes, etc. Great ceremony. And we saw yesterday that it was pointing to, signifying the need for our cleansing, that we to live clean and whole lives. The same applies to the issue of mold in your house. And so mold is associated with sickness, and the priest would be then summoned to your house, and they would decide yellow mold, red mold, how serious do we need to deal with this? And sometimes they would skim all the plaster off the walls, replaster. That's a hint of God's grace. You don't just smash the house down the first time you see some defect in it. And then give it a time, and if the mold came back again, well, then the house sadly was taken out. And then if it was clean though, the birds would be used, and the same way, flown off into the desert to indicate that your house was clean. And so a delightful chapter is wrapped up, but it's chapter 15 that I want to spend a little bit of time on, because this is a pretty uncomfortable chapter. It's talking about sexual cleansing and sexual purity, and it's a pretty uncomfortable chapter. I never ever would have read this to my children for bedtime reading. Although the Bible uses tasteful language, the subject is quite a graphic one. And so when it speaks in these verses about the discharge of men and etc., most medical and theological people would say that that's related to venereal disease. And so, it's saying that the beds would need to be cleaned and washed, and, talking about the sexual diseases that men carry. And then it speaks about the woman's sexuality and also tries to give some sort of dignity to her. Now, if you read this text in isolation, you might be forgiven for thinking that, God was against sex, which he clearly isn't if you read the whole of the Bible. What he's doing here is separating the sexuality of the people of Israel to everybody else's sexuality. He's saying, no, listen, it's holy. And verse 31 of chapter 15 says it this way: you must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defying my dwelling place, which is among them. Basically saying, this is in the context of sexuality, that we don't want to live our sexual lives out like the pagans do. And we know that as believers in Jesus, his standard for sexuality is beautiful and it's pure. In fact, it reflects Jesus and his church. And it's confined within the realms of marriage. And so that'll bring us into direct conflict with the world in which we live in terms of sexual orientation and sexual practice, pornography, promiscuity, and the different expressions of sexuality which are outside of a monogamous marriage. And so God's saying to his people, listen, I want you to be separate. I want you to be kept apart sexually. And you might say, well, God, it's difficult when we're living in a world like we're living in, bombarded by all sorts of the sexual revolution that we're living in, all sorts of values that are counter-scriptural. But God has made us fearfully and wonderfully. Our holiness is not dependent on us. It's by the Spirit that we put to death the misdeeds of the flesh. And it's by the walking in the Spirit that we're able to walk in God's ways. So I trust as you read these, it's an uncomfortable text, that you realize that God's plan for you is holy and righteous and glorious in every way. God bless you.